نصري نورك برحيم يا رحماني أبديك يا يوم يا ربي سبحاني نصري نورك برحيم يا رحماني واني أنسك يوم ربك يا ديننا بريتي يوم قلبي يا إيماننا قدي يوم جروتي يا إبادة بريتي كل جروكي يا شهادنا كني قيا غلقي يا من التلافي في قربيتي يا موعتا يومي يوبرسك جباني نصري نورك برحيم يا رحماني بحارنا قولي بكم زكي يلي عطما ناديسي بلي ساكي يلي نبريتش ربي جرين يكي يلي يكرانا تيسي الكنيف يلي إيمانا بريتش جرين يكي يلي صداكنا كني ربي يا رحماني نصري نورك برحيم يا رحماني أبديك يا يوم يا ربي سبحاني نصري نورك برحيم يا رحماني أبديك يا يوم يا ربي يا يوم يا ربي سبحاني نصري نورك برحيم يا رحماني أبديك يا يوم يا ربي سبحاني نصري نورك برحيم يا رحماني بسم الله جدا ولا ربيكو الحمد لله فارو ربيكانكو كرا ربيكنا يوم كبركو دينتنا شمسي يوم قلبيكانكو جلتاك جلسي ربي يا رحماني نصري نورك برحيم يا رحماني نوكا جلسي ربي يوم أمرين كيتي ثبت قلبي تنغر ديني كيتي خيرين دبفتين في شرتي يوم نلافسي كلمة ديني كيتي قلبي نلنجسي برسي بجباني نصري نورك برحيم يا رحماني أبديك يا يوم يا ربي سبحاني نصري نورك برحيم يا رحماني واني أنسك يوم ربك يا ديننا بريتي يوم قلبي يا
topic was drugs, if I'm not mistaken, and the harms and the effects of drugs upon the individual and upon the community. I don't know about here in Minneapolis, not Minneapolis, but where I come from on the East Coast, I would say that drugs have shaped and influenced and touched on one level or another everybody, especially from my generation, being born and raised in the 80s and the early 90s, and even more so for brothers who are older than me. And subhanallah, one wave after another, from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, and the new era, and the evolution of drugs, the use and the abuse of them. If you haven't done drugs, if you're not related to a drug addict, one who has or has not recovered, if you didn't lose a family member to drugs through using drugs, you lost a family member from selling drugs. If you didn't lose a family member from selling drugs, meaning dying from an overdose, then you lost a family member through incarceration. If you didn't lose them through being killed. If you weren't raised in a neighborhood of drugs, then you heard about it, you saw it. It was glorified, romanticized, talked about in a song, in a movie, in a cartoon, in a book, in a novel, in a comic book. If you weren't influenced or directly or indirectly touched by that, then you were touched by drugs through your sports hero, your favorite musician, your favorite poet, your favorite athlete was a drug addict, whether you knew it or not. The point that I'm trying to get to is that drugs and their effects and their harms and their impacts is something that I would say, at least where I come from, maybe different out here, maybe the same, in most cases is the same, has touched each and every single one of us on one level or another. And many things that we do in our lives, and many things that we don't do based off of drugs. With regards to the brother who has a corporate job, he's making good money, he's an overachiever, oftentimes that's an indirect reaction to drugs on one level or another. So under any circumstance, are drugs a topic which are to be considered taboo, not spoken about, not talked about, hush, shush, push and sweep under the rug? And another dynamic and aspect of drugs is racism, prejudice, and discrimination, bigotry. We don't do drugs, only those people do drugs. This race, they're the only ones who abuse drugs, not this race. Or drugs aren't a serious problem, or this type of drug isn't a serious problem until this race starts smoking it. Now it's a problem. Or those who think and feel, obviously they're involved with drugs and the trafficking of drugs, but I don't touch the drug directly. I don't deal with the people, the junkies. I don't deal with the prostitutes and whores. I don't deal with the violent lords. I just deal with drugs from a corporate business aspect. So I'm better. I'm morally better. I'm ethically better. I can sleep at night. But whether you like it or not, your living, your profession, your profits, your children's school education, your wife's diamond, wedding ring, etc. from drugs. So there are different aspects, different levels, different relationships that people have with drugs on an individual scale and as a community, as a race, as a generation, as a masjid, as a neighborhood, as a city, as a state, etc. And that's a fact. So it's sad that we don't do enough talks, we don't write enough books, we don't have enough consciousness and awareness of drugs, especially once again to the youth, who are the primary targets for drugs and who are the primary audience for the love and the glorification of drugs and the culture of drugs and the good, the bad, and the ugly that comes with drugs. That's a fact. But where I come from and how I was raised and where I was raised, there lies no doubt. You either directly or indirectly touched by the influence of drugs, for good or for bad, for good or for bad. So with that being said, our religion, our faith, our way of life, our way of death, because that's what Islam is. It's a way of living and dying. It isn't just a religion, it isn't just a faith, but it's a complete system on anything and everything that can possibly take place in the life of the human being, period. That's what Islam is. It's a system, explicit and inexplicit, direct and indirect, general and specific, for everything and anything that can happen in your life, from the time you're born until the time in which you leave this world. That's what Islam is. So what has our perfect system, what has our flawless way of life and death told us about drugs? What advice, what rulings, what mandates, what do's and don'ts has Allah Azza wa Jal told us about drugs? And as the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam told us about drugs. Let us read from chapter 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 90, verse 91. And let's see what Allah Azza wa Jal tells us about drugs and why drugs are bad and evil and negative and why we should stay away from them and what do they do to the individual and to the community. And we know that Surah Al-Ma'idah, regardless of certain ayat, as a whole, the surah was from the last of the surahs that were sent down upon the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Allah says, after we seek refuge in him from the accursed shaitan, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إنما الخمر والميسر والأنصاب والأزلام رجس من عمل الشيطان فاجتنبوه لعلكم تفلحون إنما يريد الشيطان أن يوقع بينكم العداوة والبغضاء في الخمر والميسر ويصدكم عن ذكر الله وعن الصلاة فهل أنتم منتهون. Moving forward to verse 92. وأطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول واحذروا فإن توليتم فاعلموا أنما على رسولنا البلاغ المبين. قال ابن سعدي رحمه الله تعالى في تفسير هذه الآيات الكريمات: يذم تعالى هذه الأشياء القبيحة ويخبر أنها من عمل الشيطان وأنها رجس فاجتنبوه أي اتركوه لعلكم تفلحون، فإن الفلاح لا يتم إلا بترك ما حرم الله، خصوصا هذه الفواحش المذكورة وهي الخمر، وهي كل ما خامر العقل أي غطاه بسكره، والميسر هو جميع المغالبات التي فيها عوض من الجانبين كالمراهنة ونحوها، والأنصاب التي هي الأصنام والأنداد ونحوها ممن ينصب ويعبد من دون الله، والأزلام التي يستقسمون بها، فهذه الأربعة نهى الله عنها وزجر وأخبر عن مفاسدها الداعية إلى تركها واجتنابها. فمنها أنها رجس أي خبث، نجس أو نجس معنى وإن لم تكن نجسة حسا، والأمور الخبيثة مما ينبغي اجتنابها وعدم التدنس بأوضارها. ومنها أنها من عمل الشيطان الذي هو أعدى الأعداء للإنسان، ومن المعلوم أن العدو يحذر منه وتحذر مصايده وأعماله، خصوصا الأعمال التي يعملها ليوقع فيها عدوه فإنها فيها هلاكه. فالحزم كل الحزم البعد عن عمل العدو المبين والحذر منها والخوف من الوقوع فيها. ومنها أنه لا يمكن الفلاح للعبد إلا باجتنابها، فإن الفلاح هو الفوز بالمطلوب المحبوب والنجاة من المرهوب، وهذه الأمور مانعة من الفلاح ومعوقة له. ومنها أن هذه موجبة للعداوة والبغضاء بين الناس، والشيطان حريص على بثها، خصوصا الخمر والميسر، ليوقع بين المؤمنين العداوة والبغضاء. فإن في الخمر من انغلاب العقل وذهاب حجاه ما يدعو إلى البغضاء بينه وبين إخوانه المؤمنين، خصوصا إذا اقترن بذلك من السباب ما هو من لوازم شارب الخمر، فإنه ربما أوصل إلى القتل. وما في الميسر من غلبة أحدهما للآخر وأخذ ماله الكثير في غير مقابلة ما هو من أكبر الأسباب للعداوة والبغضاء. ومنها أن هذه الأشياء تسد القلب ويتبعه البدن عن ذكر الله وعن الصلاة اللذين خلق لهما العبد وبهما سعادته، فالخمر والميسر يصدانه عن ذلك أعظم صد، ويشتغل قلبه ويذهل لبه في الاشتغال بهما حتى يمضي عليه مدة طويلة وهو لا يدري أين هو. فأي معصية أعظم وأقبح من معصية تدنس صاحبها وتجعله من أهل الخبث وتوقعه في أعمال الشيطان وشباهه، فينقاد له كما تنقاد البهيمة الذليلة لراعيها، وتحول بين العبد وبين فلاحه، وتوقع العداوة والبغضاء بين المؤمنين، وتصد عن ذكر الله وعن الصلاة. فهل فوق هذه المفاسد شيء أكبر منها؟ ولهذا عرض تعالى على العقول السليمة النهي عنها عرضا بقوله فهل أنتم منتهون، لأن العاقل إذا نظر إلى بعض تلك المفاسد انزجر عنها وكفت نفسه، ولم يحتج إلى وعظ كثير ولا زجر بليغ. So in chapter 5 verse 90, Allah the Sublime and the Exalted, He says what is translated to mean, O you who believe, O faithful, O Muslims, O my dutiful servants, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. Allah Azza wa Jal, He tells us that the following things are nothing more than filth from the handiwork of the devil. And these things are: number one, al-khamr, wine, wal-maysir, gambling, wal-ansab, idols and idolatry, wal-azlam, and different ways of divination, finding and looking for the future, whether it be drawing in the sand, reading a palm, etc., etc. All of these things are filthy and they're from the work of shaitan. فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ. So stay away from them. Don't go near them. Don't deal with them. Don't handle them. Don't play with them. Don't eat from them. Don't serve them. Don't sell them. فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ. Keep far away from them in order for you to be successful. Allah the Mighty and the Most High, He then says, and the shaitan, the only thing that he wants from these things, from drugs, from intoxication, from gambling, the only intention that he has is to spread al-adawata wal-baghdha, hatred, malice, envy, mutual nastiness. وَيَصُدَّكُمْ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. And he wishes to hinder you, to stop you, to halt you from the remembrance of Allah and from the prayer. So will you stop? فَهَلْ أَنْتُمْ مُنْتَهُونَ. This is what I've explained to you. It's clear. It's common sense. There's nothing hidden. There's no ambiguity of that lifestyle. Will you stop before it's too late? Allah the Exalted then says, and obey Allah and obey His Messenger and beware. وَاحْذَرُوا. Be cautious. Be mindful. Never fall into heedlessness or negligence. And if you turn away, if you don't listen, if that's not clear enough for you, if you choose to follow your desires over that which you can clearly see is harmful and destructive and evil and ruinous, then know for sure that the only thing upon our messenger is to convey the clear message. Khalas, you've been warned. You've seen it. You grew up in the household of drugs. You saw your father, your grandfather, your uncle. You've learned, you've seen it firsthand how ruinous they are. And you still want to do it. You still want to play with it. You still want to dip and dab in it. Then that's fine. We've given you the clear message. Ibn Sa'di, rahimahullah ta'ala, he says regarding these ayat in his tafsir, that Allah the Most High, in these ayat, He is condemning. He's frowning upon, looking down on these things. يَذُمُّ. He's condemning them. He's blaming them. And He's telling us that these things are filthy, repugnant, reprehensible, and they are from the work of the shaitan. فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ أُتْرُكُوهُ. Leave them be. Don't mess with them. Don't mess with the people who mess with them, in order for you to be successful. He says, and that's because no slave can be successful unless he avoids the haram. Bottom line, if you want to succeed in this world and the hereafter, the Muslim can only do so by avoiding what Allah Azza wa Jalla has made unlawful, especially these things. All things that are haram, but especially those four mentioned things. And the first of them is al-khamr. And the word khamr, when it's mentioned in the Quran or Sunnah, by default is talking about wine. Whether that's wine from dates, honey, barley, hops, or grapes, or any other substance. But included in that is anything which is khimar. Right? What does a woman put on her head? She wears a khimar. And the reason why it's called a khimar because it covers her skull. It covers her forehead, her neck. And this is the metaphysical understanding of khamar. Is anything that covers your head. It's covering your brain. Meaning, when you're taking drugs, when you're selling drugs, when you're eating from drug money, when you're fighting a rival drug lord or drug dealer, you can't think straight. Impossible. It's no way that you're using reason when it comes to drugs. And perhaps we'll get into that later on, of how destructive drugs were upon the individual and the community, not just for the drug addict. And that's one of the tricks of the shaitan. The one who sells the drugs, he says, I'm not a crackhead. I'm not stuck on that. I'm making money. I'm feeding my family. I'm taking care of my mother. I'm taking my family out of the hood. So on and so on and so on and so forth. I'm not like those filthy drug addicts on the street. And he thinks that he's better than them. or the partial functioning drug addict who says I can quit anytime I want to, or the one who is forced to make any act of betrayal and deceit and brutal violence against his own brother because his brain is covered. He can't think straight. Or those who think that they're better than the drug dealers and the drug users and the drug peddlers, and they turn a blind eye to where all of that money is coming in from, whether they're politicians or lawmakers or policymakers. My son goes to an Ivy League school, but we all know where that money is coming from. We all know the blind eye that you turn and the bribery, etc., because the drug money is so powerful that it covers a person's brains. And you look at the history of this country, and you talk about one of the most popular things in pop media was the mafia, specifically the Sicilian mafia, let alone the Italian mafia, and other mafias as well, the Irish, the Jews, the Chinese, the Russians, the Turkish, the Albanians, etc. Different types of mafias. But for years it was well known that the Sicilian mafia did not allow any involvement with drugs. And they had a rule: you deal, you go. Bottom line. Why did they take such a harsh stance against drugs? Because drugs are immoral, because drugs are dirty and filthy, because they want to live a legal life? No. But they knew that drugs brought in so much money, so quick, so fast, so easy, that it was impossible for those values of loyalty, secrecy, silence to be upheld. I want to be loyal, I want to follow the rules, I want to stay loyal to someone and so forth, Cosa Nostra, etc., but the money is just too fast, it's too sweet. 10 times faster than any racketeering or loan sharking or gambling or extortion, let alone legal washed laundromat businesses. And that's with regards to them who thought they were better than those who own the street corners, who did crimes against their own moms, sold drugs to their mothers, killed their own family members because their brains were what? Covered, can't see clearly. Physically or metaphysically, the drugs, it makes you in a drunken state in which you put a khimar over your brain and you're no longer seeing anything what needs to be seen. And if you can't see, if you can't think, you're bound to do anything against yourself or against your own community, let alone others. So al-khamr initially means wine. And just think about what Allah says about wine in the time of the Sahaba, verse 20-22. And the pills and the opioids and all the other things that people suffer from and are addicted to. But khamr is that which covers the brain. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He also spoke on al-maysir. And that's any act of competition, any act of competing in which there is financial, economic gain and loss. Compensation, someone is giving, both are giving, and only one takes away, one walks away. And that includes all types of gambling. Cards, dice, bones, whatever you use to gamble, in which we both pay money and only one of us walks away with it. Or all of us pay money and only one of us walks away from it. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He speaks on al-ansab, idols, things that are set up, things that are erected for the purpose of worship and for the people to devote themselves to those things. And included in that is the internet. It's a fact. Rather, that's some of the terms that they use. Worshipping this and the worship of that. That's your totem pole, that's your deity, that's your ilah that you worship. It controls you, you obey it. It says come, you come. It says you can get a little bit of sleep, you get a little bit of sleep. As soon as you wake up, that's the first thing you think about it, etc., etc. It's an idol. It's something which is worshipped besides Allah. And then He says here, wal azlam, and the things that the people use to seek help, seek knowledge of the unseen, so on and so forth. He says, so all of these things Allah has forbidden His servants from, and He's informed us in these ayat of their harms and of their cons, and that they're filthy, metaphysically, even if they aren't physically filthy. And that the Muslim is supposed to avoid being touched and stained by that filth. He then says, especially these things which are a cause of hatred, mutual hatred, and which the shaitan uses to destroy the servant. So therefore it only makes sense to stay away from them. Now what are the problems with drugs? What are the problems with gambling? What are the problems with alcohol? What are the problems with getting high or helping someone else get high? Don't drugs make people feel good? Aren't drugs an escape from reality? Aren't drugs a means for poor people who suffer to enjoy something in life? Because all they do is suffer. So drugs give them a chance to escape that harsh reality of suffering. Don't drugs bring in income and bring in profit? Can we make business with drugs? Can we build things, rebuild our communities with drugs? So on and so on and so forth. The justifications for drugs and for alcohol and for gambling and these things. Why are they so bad? Number one, he says, from the harms and the cons of these things is that it causes the people to hate each other and to dislike each other and to abhor each other. And that's something that the shaitan is very keen on doing. As far as wine, and as I explained, anything else that covers your head, you smoke it, you inject it, you snort it, you chew it, you swallow it, you eat it, you drink it, however you put it in your body, whatever is the means of you taking in that intoxication, he says, then it overcomes one's brain and it causes a person to hate his own believing brothers. And when a person gets drunk, when a person gets high, what do? They curse, they swear, they slander, they lose all inhibitors and they start saying things. And then what happens when a person slanders or curses or insults you or insults your wife or one of your women? What's the first thing you're going to do? So now there's violence. I'm not talking about fists or beer bottles. I'm talking about guns. He said this, so I'm going to do this. And then because he did this to my cousin, and I'm going to shoot him. And this one and that one. And the next thing you know, you turn around and you have a whole generation of blood feud. And it's impossible for a community to come together, to work together, to flourish when I see you, you already know what it's going to be. Don't be caught without such and such. If we such and such and such and such. And then it's over. Khalas, it's done. And just think about this. I don't have to lecture you guys on blood feuds. And when there's mutual fighting, how everyone is going to suffer. The poor, the weak, the innocent. Those who aren't involved in the violence, they're going to what? They're going to suffer from the constant shedding of blood. He says, so from the harms of khamr, from the harms of these things, and Allah, He mentioned this for a reason, yuqi', to throw, to hurl hatred of your brother in your own heart. You don't trust someone, you don't respect that person, you don't love that person, you don't honor that person, but there's hatred and there's envy, because when you get drunk and when you get high, the only thing that's important is getting drunk again and getting high again. Stealing, lying, selling yourself. You ever seen a woman who's a housewife? You ever seen a woman who has children sell herself for $5 of drugs? Not $50, not $500, $5, $10. You ever see someone living a good life? Becomes worse than an animal just to get high once. People chasing a high that they all know is impossible to get. That's the scary thing about drugs. You study drugs and the culture of substance abuse. Why do they keep getting high? Why do they keep ruining themselves and putting themselves at risk? Because they're chasing that first encounter with the drug, which they all know can never ever be encountered again. But because it was so good and so strong, they keep going after and after and after and after, chasing that thing. You make constant ibadah of it. And that's unfortunate. Ibn Sa'di rahimahullah ta'ala, he says, cursing, swearing, slandering, fighting and arguing, he says, min lawazim, is from the things that are attached to alcoholism. There's no way people aren't getting high without talking crazy. That's a fact. And when they talk crazy, it's physical violence. And when there's physical violence, then there's what? Adawa and Baghdad. There's hatred for each other. There's revenge, there are blood feuds, and of course, then that's clear the effect upon the community, let alone the individual. As far as gambling and the problems with gambling, he says, then this causes a person's money, a person's wealth to be stolen, a person's wealth to be taken away, a person loses everything. No one's that lucky. It's impossible that you won unless you cheated. And if you cheated, you took my money, we're supposed to be having friendly gambling, now comes violence. And now comes the jealousy. And now comes a person being addicted to gambling. And he has a problem similar, if not worse, than alcoholism and drug abuse. A person can't stop gambling because it felt so good when you won. And you won so much. And that's how they get you to come back. Every single time, over and over and over again. Ibn Sa'di, he says here, so what could be worse than a person losing his mind for a very long period of time? What sin could be worse than this? What ma'asiyah could be worse than this? And which a human being who's supposed to think becomes like an animal that someone pulls and steers and directs. And that is exactly what happens to everyone who is involved with drugs. The seller and the sold too. If you're not hooked on the actual drug, you're hooked on the money. You can't quit. And that's why most people, if they get locked up for selling drugs, they come back home. It's difficult for them to get a job. That's a fact. No one wants to hire them, so on and so forth. But it's worse than that. I can't work a regular 9 to 5 after what? Getting that type of money. It's impossible. For me to have a slow, basic, boring job after what? What you make in a month, working like a dog and a slave I made in 1 day, 1 hour. That is a heavy addiction. So the drug dealer is addicted. The one obviously on the drug, they're addicted. And there are other elements of addiction as well. So what could be worse than this? That which prevents a mu'min, the believer, from prayer, from the dhikr of Allah, and from having control over his own brain. And for this reason, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he asked the rhetorical question, فَهَلْ أَنْتُمْ مُنْتَهُونَ? Is it not clear enough for you? Does it not make enough sense for you? Can you not see how destructive drugs are for the individual, let alone the community, let alone the household, let alone the country and the state, let alone the race? And unfortunately, I'm sure out here as well, but on the East Coast in the 80s and the 70s, we've seen generations destroyed because of drugs. My father, your father, his father, all locked up. We grew up without our fathers, so we didn't have the proper guidance. My father, your father, our fathers killed each other, so we grew up without our fathers, without the proper guidance. My father, your mother, etc. grew up doing drugs. So obviously they couldn't look after us, they couldn't take care of us, they couldn't raise us properly, and we grew up without the proper guidance. So one generation is ruined, and that's going to lead to generation 2 being ruined, and that's going to lead to generation 3 being ruined. So a person, whoever that person is, they can sit back and they can laugh and they say, look at this, we just wiped out 3 generations of this race. We just wiped out 3 generations of people who live in this city. 3 generations of people, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, done, ruined. That's crazy, right? It's extremely dangerous. And it's from the realities of the evils and the harms of drugs. And not like people who just demonize the drug dealer or demonize the drug addict, but everyone who's involved, from the peasant in the farm picking the leaves to the 3-piece suit wearing business tycoon or politician who allows the drugs to come into the country and to be spread, and the list goes on. So just stop and think about these things, what drugs actually do to the human being, what they do to one's soul, what they do to one's mind, let alone what they do to one's what? Physical body. And that's everybody that's involved with the drugs. As an older brother told me, my friends, my colleagues from the 80s, all gone. Shot dead, did years in prison, strung out, tried to recover, so on and so forth. So why would you give your enemy that much power and that much influence? And if you know that it's from Shaitan's plot and his tricks and his tools, why would you lower your guard to your enemy when Shaitan is a clear, plain enemy? So we can go on and on and on with regards to drugs. And it's a very long, momentous discussion from a religious and spiritual aspect, from a social aspect, from a racial aspect, a financial, economic aspect. There's so many different dimensions and colors and shades to the spectrum of drugs. What's important is, if Allah has protected you from being a victim and an addict of using and abusing a drug or selling a drug, be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you were tested and you were afflicted by using or selling a drug, and Allah saved you from that, you made repentance, you came to Islam, or you start practicing Islam, be grateful and warn your children and be mindful of who your children hang out with, who they're cool with, where are they going, what are they doing, and what are they into. And if you want to know what your children are into, you can't just ask them, son, do you do drugs? Son, do you smoke? Son, do you drink? Son, are you sleeping with girls? Because of course they know what to say. They have ready-made answers. But if you want to know how youth think and how they behave, go on a train, go into a restaurant when kids are getting out of school or going to school in the morning. And you're not intentionally eavesdropping. You're not trying to spy on what they're saying, but just go around and you'll listen to what they say. You see them on the phone, on the subway. You see the stuff that they watch, that they listen to, that they're into, and what they consider to be cool and fun and hip and stylish, or whatever word that they use. And you'll also be shocked at what many Muslim youth consider to be corny and boring and square. And that's one of the greatest dangers upon the Muslim youth, is romanticizing that lifestyle and those people and making the religious, pious, 9-to-5 hard-working family men and women to be boring and corny, and to make that lifestyle to be appealing. And there's so much we can say with regards to the culture of drugs, the hypocrisy that we find in our country here, how the smaller people, they're slammed, and the bigger people walk away free. The culture of violence, it's okay if it's in a movie, but it's not okay if it's in a rap song. You're calling to violence with your music, but what about this Grammy award-winning actor? His name is such and such. He played in this movie. How many people did he shoot in that movie? What type of guns did he have? How many people did he blow up? How many throats were slit? How many people were strangled? In this Hallmark trilogy movie that the people hail and celebrate. And the movie from beginning to end is full of violence. Rather go deeper than that. Cartoons. I don't know what the kids watch today. This era, SpongeBob, blah, 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 all of that stuff that they watch today. But when you're growing up watching Bugs Bunny, Looney Tunes, and all of that stuff, those cartoons are full of what? Tons of violence, gunplay, blowing someone's head off, blowing somebody up with TNT, Acme dynamite. That's the tarbiyah. And then when someone goes up and implements that violence, then he's a criminal. And he's a this, and he's a that. Lock him up, take him away from his family, take him away from his community. Come home, you can't get a job, no one wants to hire you. And the cycle continues and continues and continues. So it's a big problem. Drugs and the violence that is associated with drugs is a big issue in this country. And the average person is turning a blind eye, or the average person is only seeing half of it, or the average person is caught up in race and color, skin color, who's good, who's bad, so on and so forth. And the average person who's actually trying to fight drugs, they're fighting the wrong people. They're going after the wrong people. And they're not actually going to the core of the problem. And the list goes on and on and on and on and on, right? What's important is that the Muslims, we should do our duty, and we should try our best to be on our P's and our Q's, to be aware, to be conscious, never ever to sleep, never ever to close our eyes on the vice and the scourge of drugs in our communities, especially for our children. So we have to raise consciousness, awareness. We have to read these ayat, read these hadiths. We have to talk about it, speak about it. We have to be aware of it. We have to warn our children. And inshallah ta'ala, hopefully we can minimize the victims. But there will be victims. And there lies no doubt there will be prey that is attacked and preyed upon. But it's our job to try our best to minimize that. Everybody's not going to listen. Everybody's not going to stay away. Some people are going to try drugs because it's fun. Because my favorite movie star did it. My favorite athlete did it. My favorite rapper did it. The best lyrics that I write is when I'm what? When I'm high. That's a fact. So on and so on and so forth. So we ask Allah for protection. And what the Prophet ﷺ tells us regarding wanting one for your brother, what you want for yourself. How could you want that for another human being? How could you be pleased with another human being to live the life that you know its ins and its outs? And the last thing that I'll say is a piece of wisdom that an older brother gave to me, very close friend of mine, one of my life coaches. He said that, he asked me a question once. He says, out of all of the different athletes, tough guys, killers, heroes, so on and so forth, he says, do you know the only one that has an undefeated record that's never ever lost? Not once. I said, no, I don't know of anyone. He said, there's one that's never ever lost, and that's the streets. The streets, drugs, violence, he says they've never ever lost. They have a totally flawless record. No one has been involved with them. In them, it's walked out unscathed on one level or another. You keep your life, but you're wounded, you're maimed. You lose your mind, you lose your health, you lose 20, 30, 40 years out of your life. And the list goes on, let alone if you're actually losing your life. You're actually dying, so on and so forth. So to think that you can dip into it, dab into it, to think that you can test it out and sample it and then make tawbah and then walk away, you're a fool. Streets don't lose. Drugs don't lose. Anyone who deals with them is an automatic loser, and that's a fact. Many people who wash their illegal money, wash their drug money, walk away from it, they make legitimate businesses, they go wear three-piece suits, so on and so forth. Next thing you know, the person that's a junkie or an addict or a prostitute are their children. And that's a fact. You can read about this. I walked away, but my son didn't. I walked away, I'm clean, I'm good, but my daughter is caught up in what I used to do in my lifestyle. And it lies no doubt, it's going to come back to haunt you. It's going to come back to haunt you. So that lifestyle never ever lost. It doesn't lose, and it's no way that you have a chance to stand and fight it. Therefore, فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ. Stay away from it. لَعَلَّكُمْ تُفْلِحُونَ. In order for you to be successful, in order for you to win, don't fight it. May Allah guide us all, help us all, and may Allah make it easy for all of the Muslims who are fighting drug addiction, fighting recovery, rehabilitation, fighting, avoiding, relapsing. Only Allah knows the nature of those struggles, mental, physical, and spiritual. Wallahu ta'ala alam.
Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for everyone that came tonight, that's been here throughout the night with us. I want to thank the volunteers and the Sheikh as well. The Sheikh has made a long journey from New York to our state of Minnesota. So inshallah, let's make dua for him and make sure that he's able to continue and benefit the Muslims, and he's also to stay in good health, and that he gets back safely to his home, inshallah, and his family. So that concludes our night of events, inshallah. So jazakallah khair for coming. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Also, one last thing. Tomorrow we'll be having four more halaqas at Masjid Bilal. We have Jum'ah prayer. The talk will be Hope in the Mercy of Allah. Or today, actually. And then we have three more talks. Yeah, long night. SubhanAllah. And Sheikh Las will have